you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here's the video that you came here for, because there is one more topic that I want to get to, and it is actually something that we discussed a little bit on Wednesday's Aaron Torres pod, and it involves that lengthy expansion college sports realignment article that Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated put out. So if you listen to Wednesday's show, I did a very long segment on it. It honestly probably went a little too long. But either way, we talked a lot about the ACC. We talked a lot about the Pac-12. And at the end, I mentioned a little nugget about UConn and the Big 12. At least, you know, they're looking at each other from across the bar. I'm not saying the Big 12 has come all over and offered to buy a drink. I'm not saying that UConn slipped some digits to the Big 12. I'm just saying that it was in the article, and I talked about it on Wednesday's show. Here's the thing. Since I did that show, there has been a lot, let's be honest, of very bad and uninformed reporting on UConn's current situation. Basically, everybody in the national media has used that one little nugget to basically say, UConn, you'd be crazy to leave the Big East. You left the Big East once. Don't ever do it again. And so what I want to do is I want to do a little bit of fact and fiction on this UConn Big 12 story. Now, I'll readily admit it is my school, but I can also tell you I have some pretty high-level contacts at the school. I'm not bragging. It's just a fact. And the idea that is being floated out by the national media, outside of me, of course, is basically, I think it's completely wrong. And so let's get into it. Let's dive in and let's discuss. And let's start with the concept that most of the national media seems to believe as to why these conversations are happening. The concept is pretty straightforward. It is that UConn left the Big East once to chase football glory in the AAC, and the idea that has been floated by Pat Forty at ESPN, by The Athletic, is that UConn is pursuing the Big 12, or the conversations are happening because they again want to pursue football glory. Essentially, they're saying this basketball thing is fun, but the Big East has been cool, but let's go back to trying to chase football glory. And so what I can tell you, that is not accurate at all. That is not the way the athletic department is thinking. And so again, let's get into some fact and fiction. First off, and UConn fans know this, but a lot of people don't. Let's make one thing clear. UConn did not leave the Big East the first time. The Big East became a basketball-only league, or a no-football league. And so if you played FBS football, they didn't have a home for you. Central Florida got kicked out. Cincinnati got kicked out. Whatever. And UConn was one of the teams that didn't have a home. And so they didn't leave the Big East. They got kicked out, essentially. Two, let's also call a spade here. When UConn went to the AAC then and now is not what the Big 12 is or will be if UConn ever enters that conference. And I'm not saying that it's done or it will happen, but the Big 12 is a lot different. Now, is the Big 12 the SEC? Is it the Big 10? It isn't. But what the Big 12 is a steady conference. And that, by the way, was the entire Ross Dellinger article, right? The entire Ross Dellinger article was basically everybody that's not in the SEC or the ACC is doing whatever they can to find a landing spot that is stable ground. That the ACC is kind of on shaky ground. The Pac-12 is definitely on shaky ground, and everybody's trying to find a landing spot. The Big 12 would provide that because the Big 12 is going to be in its current existence for the foreseeable future. Long-term TV contract, ESPN, Fox, they're good to go. So let's eliminate the thought that UConn voluntarily left the Big East the first time, and that the Big 12 currently, or in a year or two or 5 or 10 or whatever, is the same as what the AAC was a few years ago. Much more money involved in the Big 12 if UConn one day gets there. And to be clear, not saying UConn will be. Big 12's got to figure out what they're doing with some of those Pac-12 schools. They've talked to San Diego State. They've talked to Gonzaga as a basketball-only member. So to be clear, again, there's a lot to be figured out. But that last part is the important part. It is the money that we are discussing when it comes to leaving the Big East potentially for the Big 12. Here is the bottom line with the Big East, okay? It's hard to find exact numbers on what Big East schools are making. I actually spent quite a bit of time looking it up over the last couple, hours or so before I started the show. And as best I can tell, the Big East TV contract currently pays somewhere in the neighborhood of between $5 and $10 million a year. $5 and $10 million a year. So even if the higher side of that contract is $10 million, and I understand that there are other streams of revenue, ticket sales, merchandise, donations, etc., you're still talking about a third of what the Big 12 is going to get and pennies on the dollar compared to what some of these other schools in the Big 10 and the SEC will be making in a year or two when their new TV contracts kick in. And so I bring it up because when the national media, except for me, because I'm smart and I actually talk to sources and stuff like that, when the national media is trying to tell you UConn is chasing football glory going to the Big 12, no, it's actually the exact opposite. UConn has one of the best across-the-board athletic departments in the country. But to keep it elite in basketball, women's basketball, baseball's in the top 25, men's ice hockey was in the top 15 this year, women's ice hockey was very good. It's actually not about football at all. It's about doing what it takes to protect all of those other sports, because if you are men's basketball and you want to compete at the highest level with the Indianas, the Kentuckys, the Purdues, the UCLA, which is going to the Big 10, it's going to be hard to do it on a seventh or eighth of the money that they're making. And I'll give you an example, and I used this example on Wednesday's show. Let's say in a year from now, there's an SEC basketball power that could conceivably need a new head basketball coach. Now, I'm not saying John Calipari is definitely out after this year at Kentucky. And I'm not saying that Dan Hurley would be Kentucky's first choice. But imagine the scenario where it doesn't work for Cal. He announces, it's time, I'm going to step into my administrative role. And Kentucky starts putting together their list of candidates. Now, first of all, I think Dan Hurley is about to get a massive extension this offseason, a massive raise. Keep this number in the back of your head. When it comes out, I bet he's a $6 million a year head coach. That, by the way, on an $8, $9, $10 million a year TV budget. But let's say Kentucky needs a new head coach in a year. Or my boy Mike Effin Woodson retires at Indiana. And Indiana's making $90 million a year in TV money. Or Ohio State needs a new head coach. Or pretty much pick any Big 10 or SEC school. UCLA, Big Mick Energy, Mick Cronin decides to do something else. And UCLA needs a coach. Any of those schools can write any check they need. So if Kentucky deems, let's say a year from now, Kentucky, John Calipari moves on. And Kentucky deems that Dan Hurley is the man that they need to replace John Calipari going forward. Not saying it would happen. Not saying he'd be their number one candidate. But let's just say that's the scenario. And let's say Kentucky says, Coach Hurley, here's a check, fill in the zeros. And as I said on Wednesday, they offer him a 10-year, $80 million contract. $8 million a year for the next decade, which isn't inconceivable, by the way. Calipari's on $8, $9 million a year. So that isn't inconceivable that Kentucky could offer Dan Hurley the same thing or more. Or maybe it's an 8-year, $80 million deal, $10 million a year. UConn's a basketball school with basketball tradition, with basketball fan base. UConn cannot match that salary. And if Kentucky has success next year and John Calipari stays, what happens if North Carolina, making $30+ million a year in TV money, offers the same contract? Or Indiana offers the same contract? Or UCLA offers the same contract? Or Kansas, making $30+ million a year in the Big 12, offers that same contract? UConn can't compete. I'll take it a step further. We are headed towards an NIL free-for-all going forward. And I know it's been a conversation. I know nobody knows exactly what everybody's getting, and this guy's supposed to be getting this, and that guy's supposed to be getting that, and the school can't be involved. But listen, the bottom line is it's all hands on deck money-wise. And if you're making $10 million a year and you're paying your basketball coach $6 million, or you got to pay him $8 million now because somebody came out and you got to match him, what happens with your other sports? By the way, I should mention again, UConn's elite in a lot of sports. Their baseball is in the top 20 right now. Michigan came after their baseball coach, Jim Penders, last offseason. Jim Penders said, thanks, but no thanks. What happens if an SEC school says, you know what? This guy's winning in Connecticut. Let's bring him down to Mississippi State, which I'm told will need a baseball coach after this year, even winning the national championship 2 years ago. Alabama's going to be looking for a new baseball coach. I don't know what the market is for baseball coaches, but I'm guessing if Alabama thinks that UConn's baseball coach is the guy, they can pay whatever it takes. Same with Mississippi State, same with Georgia, same with whomever. And so you start to add up the money. That is why UConn would consider the Big 12, because it's about paying your coaches. It's about facilities. It's about not falling behind in NIL. Dan Hurley had an interesting interview a few weeks ago where he said, look, we don't want kids picking us solely because of NIL, but we don't want to lose kids because we can't compete either in that space. So there's a lot of moving parts with finances right now. And so this is why UConn is considering the Big 12, or at least willing to listen if the Big 12 came in and wanted to have a conversation. To be clear, doesn't mean anything's going to happen. And to be clear, by the way, and I think this is an important point, it's not as though the UConn fan base is in universal agreement. I would probably venture to guess it's probably 60-40 fans that understand the economics, that understand that to stay at the highest level, it might not be in the Big East, versus those that are saying, we did leave once and it didn't work out well. We don't want to risk it again. We're winning in basketball. That's what matters. But again, to continue to compete at this level. By the way, at some point, Gino Auriemma is going to retire. You're going to have to pay a lot of money to the next person to make sure that they keep the program elevated the way that he has had it for the last 30 years. Baseball is a factor. Hockey is a factor. I'm just saying this is why UConn is considering the Big 12. Not saying it will happen. Not saying it's definitive. What I am saying is there are legitimate reasons that are not being reported on. And Torres, Colin Cowherd calls himself America's truth broker. Well, I am America's truth broker on UConn athletics. All right, I think that's it for